I have two pictures I want to show you. First, this is a picture from Mexico City. Do you understand what is going on in this picture? Second, this is how much cash you would have had to carry to buy one roll of toilet paper in October 2018 in Venezuela. Maybe you noticed that there's more paper in the cash than there is in the toilet paper, which might make you wonder, why would you change more paper for less paper? In this lecture, we want to talk about how these two pictures are related, how it relates to economic development, and how it relates to Alexander Hamilton. In the last lecture, we talked about the War for Independence, the American Revolution, the economic causes and consequences of this major event. Well, right after this happens, we establish the Constitution of the United States, a major change in world political history. And along with that Constitution, we create the Bill of Rights. And the first Bill of Rights promises freedom of speech. Let me read this to you. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Now, America is pretty proud of this amendment, and this is something that America has kind of been known for freedom of speech. Like America, we try to say whatever we want, but America is not the only country that promises freedom of speech. Let me show you some of the promises from other countries. Citizens enjoy freedom of speech, of the press, of assembly, of association, of procession, and of demonstration. That's a pretty good protection of free speech. Where is that available? In China. Everyone has the right to express freely his or her thoughts, ideas, or opinions orally, in writing, or by any other form of expression, and to use for such purpose any means of communication and diffusion, and no censorship shall be established. Wow, those are pretty good protections right there. It's protecting your ideas, your opinions, your writing, no censorship. That might possibly be better than what we have here in the United States. Where is that available? Venezuela. Everyone shall be guaranteed the freedom of ideas and speech. The propaganda or agitation instigating social, racial, national, or religious hatred and strife shall not be allowed. The propaganda of social, racial, national, religious, or linguistic supremacy shall be banned. No one may be enforced to express his views and convictions or to reject them. Everyone shall have the right to freely look for, receive, transmit, produce, and distribute information by any legal way. The freedom of mass communication shall be guaranteed. Censorship shall be banned. Holy smokes, that has a lot of protection in it. A lot of protections that people have been asking for in the United States. Is hate speech protected under freedom of speech? That's debatable in the First Amendment in the United States. In this one, it makes it very clear. You are not allowed to say things that promote racial or linguistic supremacy. There's no censorship. You can look for whatever information you want. This is a really powerful promise. Where is this available? In Russia. Hopefully you're catching the irony of the juxtaposition of these promises of freedom of speech with the countries that they're coming from. And of course, there are going to be people out there complaining that the United States has just the same problem in juxtaposition. But let me just make this clear. The United States has a pretty great track record on freedom of speech. And this is actually a unique characteristic of the United States, at least historically. Antonin Scalia, a former judge on the Supreme Court, has said that it is the beginning of wisdom to acknowledge that the Constitution says what it says. And the fullness of wisdom is to recognize that the crowning achievement of America is not the Bill of Rights. Every modern banana republic has one, but rather the structure of government and the democratic tradition that makes a Bill of Rights enforceable according to its terms and not according to the wishes of the ruler. So the unique characteristic of the United States is not that we have a law, but that people actually believe that that is a law, that it's enforceable, that I can go out there and say things about the president and not be taken down and put in prison as a result. How do we get to the spot? How do we get to a country that is able to enforce the rules that it sets? That's what we want to talk about in this lecture. That's how these two pictures are related, and we're going to get an idea of state capacity. So what is a state? Max Weber, the famous sociologist that has come up before in the Angerman and Sokolov lecture, defined it as the human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of violence within a given territory. What does the monopoly on violence mean? That means there's only one entity that can actually legitimately use violence to enforce laws or decisions or behavior. So like putting someone in jail, right? Like if I were to just grab you right now and throw you in a jail cell, that would get me a little bit in trouble. But if the government does it and they say, well, you did something wrong, we say, these are the laws that you broke, therefore we can legitimately put you in this jail cell and it's legal, then, we might not like it, but we have endowed that organization, that entity, with the ability to do that. Now, in some cases, it's not even the formal use, like a formal government. It's not like someone who's been elected. In some cases, it's just through, social communities like gangs or, something that says we're going to maintain order by saying anyone who breaks the order will then be either imprisoned or shot or something like that, right? We're not going to go deep into what the state is. I'm just trying to introduce you to some concepts that are important to understanding what the state is and how these investments that they're going to make matter, because we want to talk about state capacity, the ability of the government to get things done. In some cases, that could be the ability to enforce laws through violence. In other cases, it's just we have promised freedom of speech and we want to make sure that that freedom of speech is respected. So state capacity has two components that we want to talk about. First, there's legal capacity, and that's the state's ability to enforce the rule of law, to respect property rights, to say if you own something, then you get to keep it. And if anyone tries to take it from you, you can report them and the government will come in and make sure that they respect your property. This is legal capacity, the respecting the rule of law, respecting property rights, so on. Then there's fiscal capacity, which is the state's ability to collect taxes from its territory. Fiscal capacity is not about whether it's high taxes or low taxes. It's about whether it has enough taxes to do the things it says it will do. So we have state capacity. Under state capacity, there's fiscal capacity and legal capacity. And we also want to bring up another concept, which is public goods. Now, you're going to get more of this as you take other economics classes, but public goods are these goods that are non-rival and non-excludable. They're things that the government provides to the entire population. So like defense is a really common one. When the Army goes out and defends us, or the Navy or the Air Force or the Marines or Space Force, when those organizations are out there protecting the United States, they protect everyone. It's not just people in a certain community. It's not, if you don't like the military and I do, it's not like the military's not going to protect you. They protect everyone from outside threats. That is the idea of the public good. Other things might be roads, making sure that everybody can use the roads that are in your city and making sure that those roads are usable, making sure that they're clear, making sure that everyone has access to these means of transit that connect our entire city. Now we're going to talk about how governments can invest in state capacity. So let's think about what that would mean in terms of fiscal capacity. What would a government do if it wanted to invest in fiscal capacity? Well, if fiscal capacity is the government's ability to collect taxes, then anything that improves its ability to collect would increase fiscal capacity. So what kind of investments are those going to look like? Well, you might hire more IRS agents. You might hire people who actually go out there and collect the taxes, or who go out and audit people to make sure that they're paying the right amount of taxes. You might create an online filing system, which makes it easier for people to file their taxes and get things in. You might have automatic withholdings. When you get your paycheck, that tax is automatically withdrawn from your account. That's not a system that just pops into existence. You have to invest in that kind of system. But when you do, then you actually collect a decent amount of taxes on the other side. Now let's think about legal capacity. How do you make investments that improve the rule of law and protecting property rights? Well, you might hire more police officers or invest in their training, making sure that they enforce the rule of law equitably. You might improve the judicial system, so that way any cases that are brought up against somebody else or against the government, that they're resolved quickly. Or you could invest in some sort of monitoring system. That way we can make sure that people aren't stealing things. Or you might invest in a monitoring system that makes sure that the police are actually doing what they're supposed to be doing. All of these ways of just making sure that we improve the rule of law, that we make sure people have access to the same resources in terms of legal resources, in terms of opportunity, as others. Now, it's pretty obvious that investments in fiscal capacity are going to increase the tax revenues that the government receives. But what do investments in legal capacity do? Well, let's imagine that you can choose between an Asus Chromebook, which is about $229, or you can get the MacBook Pro, which is going to be over $1,000. It's like $1,300 or something. So you have the option between a $300 computer and a $1,300 computer. Whatever the actual numbers are, let's just imagine that. Now, let's say you go to campus. You're preparing for school. You're looking at which laptop you want, and you know that if you bring this laptop to campus, there's a 50% chance that this thing's going to be stolen. Which laptop are you going to buy? Now, there's some people who would not be caught dead with an Asus Chromebook, so they're going to go for the MacBook Pro. And there are some who say that $1,300 price tag does not nearly compensate for whatever resources you're getting. You might as well go for the cheaper version. So you're going to have people who have no change in their decision, but you're going to have those people right in the middle, on the margin of making a decision of, do I go for the Chromebook or do I go for the MacBook Pro? And that 50% chance of having it stolen, that might tip them to the Chromebook, because if I know that this thing's going to be stolen with a high probability, I don't want to go and invest in a super expensive computer that's just going to go missing in a week. I would rather buy the cheaper replaceable computer. Now, suppose we install cameras on campus, or we make sure there are security guards, and we drastically reduce the chance that your laptop's going to be stolen. What's that going to do to those people right there on the margin? Some of those people are going to decide, you know what, now that I know that my laptop won't be stolen, I'm willing to go buy the more expensive computer. So legal capacity affects the investments that we make, and those investments affect the revenue that the government gets. Just look at this. Let's imagine that there's a sales tax, and just for simplicity, we're going to say it's 10% because that's easy for us to calculate. So a sales tax when they bought the Chromebook would have been $30. Now this person is going out and buying the MacBook Pro. That person's paying $130 in sales tax. That's a $100 increase. You're changing how much tax is being collected from that person by the amount 4 times, right? Where we have this huge change in tax revenues collected, even though there was no change in how we collect taxes. There was no change in the tax rate. Nothing about fiscal capacity changed. It's only about how much this person invested. They went from going at a low-end computer to a high-end computer, and that changed how much revenue the government's able to collect. And that's just on the sales tax. Let's imagine that there's actually a productivity improvement that comes from the MacBook Pro. Now this person's producing more. They have greater economic activity, and because there's greater economic activity, that person is producing more tax revenues. So legal capacity does affect tax revenues through this indirect method of how people invest. This brings us back to these pictures. This person selling pirated DVDs on the streets of Mexico City is breaking a law. It is illegal to do this in Mexico, but there are other things that the government needs to take care of while, pirated DVDs are just not at the top of their list. They don't have the legal capacity to go after people selling these DVDs. They're low on that. A similar thing is happening over here in Venezuela. Venezuela has not developed fiscal capacity, the ability to collect taxes. So what does the government do? It just prints money to try and pay off its debts. Both of these pictures are a sign of low legal and fiscal capacity. So that brings us to our next model, and we're going to go through the Besley and Pearson model. Since we just discussed legal capacity, let's start there. The state can invest in legal capacity, and that will provide a higher return on private investments. That's going from the Chromebook to the MacBook Pro. That means we're making greater investments and there's better economic activity going on. The state can also invest in fiscal capacity. That's going to lead to more efficient tax collection. The result of both of these, higher return on private investments and more efficient tax collection, is going to lead to more tax revenue for the government. What is the government going to do with this extra revenue? Well, one thing the government can do is provide the public good. They can go out there and make sure the streets are maintained. They can provide for public defense. But that's not the only thing they can do. They can go back up and they can invest in fiscal capacity and legal capacity again. So the government is deciding between 3 ways to spend its revenue: investing in legal capacity, investing in fiscal capacity, and investing in the public good. When they invest, they get more money, and with that extra money, they can then choose again where they're going to invest. And so the trade-off that they're making is, if I don't spend on the public good, am I going to get more revenue in the future to compensate that we don't have the public good today? Now, the way I like to reference this model, the way that I've drawn this out, it reminds me of Hela from Thor Ragnarok. So if you can't remember the Bestley and Pearson model, a lot of people like to just call it the Hela model. That's the model that we need to understand what's coming with Alexander Hamilton. Today's the first day that we're talking about Alexander Hamilton. We're going to talk about him again when we talk about trade, and then also when we get to finance. The way I like to remember Alexander Hamilton's role is that he was interested in building state capacity. He wanted to make sure the government could do what it said it was going to do. His economic plan was really focused on this, and it has three main components, at least three main reports. That was the report on public credit, the report on manufacturers, and the report on a national bank. Today, we're going to talk about the report on public credit. When we get to international trade, we're going to talk about the role of manufacturers, and then the report on the national bank is going to come when we talk about finance and banking. Broadly, we can summarize Hamilton's economic plan through three words: discrimination, assumption, and incorporation. We are going to talk about the first two in today's lecture. So in his report on public credit, Hamilton is really concerned about establishing credit. Like, you know, when you have a credit card, when you want to borrow something, you need to have credit. You have a credit score. Hamilton wanted the government to have credit. That means he wanted the government to be able to go and borrow money, and that those people who lend the money would be assured that that money would actually get paid back. Why did he want that? In his report on public credit, he explains that even if you think that debt is evil, even if you don't want to be associated with it at all, there are still emergencies that come up, and you want to be able to borrow money when those emergencies come up. A second reason is that when you borrow, you want to have good terms. Now, if you have good credit, if people believe that you're reliable, that you're trustworthy, they give you better rates. They're willing to give you lower interest rates on the money that you borrow. Why is that? Well, one of the reasons is that people who are untrustworthy, who aren't going to pay back everything that they borrowed, you want to get as much back as you can at the beginning. The bank or the lender can be assured that they're getting back most of their money at the beginning, and then if they actually pay back this loan over the long run, they're making a decent profit on that loan over time. But that's because they're not sure if this is actually going to work out, so they have to balance it out. But if they are really confident that you're going to pay back, they don't have to give you a really high rate. They just are excited that you have your business. They know exactly the money they're going to make, and so they give you a really low interest rate. So it's really important to have good credit, to be a reliable, trustworthy person that people will give you lower interest rates and you can get better deals on your loans. So how do governments establish credit? The same way you do. You have to prove that you're trustworthy. One way is to prove that you will honor your commitments. You show them, here are the loans that I've had in the past and I paid them all back. If you didn't have loans, you might show your rent. I've always been up to date on my rent. I've always paid back everything I've ever done. I honor my commitments. Hamilton wants the government to do the same thing. Another way that you can establish your credit is proving that you have income. Like when you go out and get your first mortgage, you are going to have to prove that you have a source of income that allows you to pay for that mortgage. Well, the government, if they want to establish credit, also needs a source of income. And for the government, that means tax revenues. The government needs to be able to collect taxes so that way it can pay back those loans that it gets. So the report on public credit is Hamilton's attempt to show how the government is going to be able to establish credit. And the first part of that is what is called discrimination. Now, discrimination obviously has its connotations today, but this has a really nuanced explanation and is not what you think today. So let's make sure you understand what discrimination meant when Hamilton was saying this. One of the ways that the government paid for the Revolutionary War and early operations in the government was to issue bonds. That means debt. Bonds are a way of crowdsourcing your debt, right? Instead of going to a bank and just getting a loan from one entity, you crowdsource this thing. You send out financial instruments to a whole bunch of people. They buy them up, and now you have a whole bunch of money to use towards the thing that you're trying to provide. The idea is, hey, this thing is worth $100. I'll sell it to you for $80, and in 5 years, you can redeem it for the full $100 value. That way, you're getting an interest rate on this. It's a value to you, but also provide something that you can buy and sell with others. If I don't want to hold on to this anymore, I could sell it to somebody and maybe I get $80 back, maybe I get a little more, who knows? But this allows a market in this debt to emerge after you issue these bonds. When it comes time to pay back the bonds, the government faces a difficult question. Who should they pay? Now, this might not sound like a controversial question, but let's imagine what's going on here. So I have this, let's represent this as a bond. You know, obviously this is not a bond. This is a really cool comic book that has to deal with cartels. We'll get to that as we get on in the semester. But let's imagine this is the bond. I am the person who originally purchased this bond, and I'm like, hey, this is great. In the future, I'm going to get some sort of return on this. But then I say, you know what? I'm going to sell it. I don't know if the government's even going to exist in a few years. I don't know if I want to hold on to this. I need some cash right now. So I find a buyer. Me, other me, I guess. I buy this from this person, give it to him, okay? So now I'm holding on to this comic book. The person who originally bought it no longer has it, but I gave them some cash. The question is, who should now get paid from the government? That $100 from the government. Should it be me, the person who currently holds this, or should it be the other me who originally bought the bond? The distinction is, do we pay the person who originally bought it or the person who is now currently holding it? This is what discrimination is. How do we discriminate between the two people who are contending for this money? So if you favor discrimination, if you want discrimination, that means you want to pay the original buyer. You want to find out who that person is. The reason why it's called discrimination is because you're going to have to discriminate. You're going to have to go and find out who is the original buyer. It's an investigative process. It's discrimination. If you are against discrimination, that means you pay whoever is currently holding the bond. There's no need to discriminate or investigate. You just say whoever comes in with this thing gets the money. Hamilton was against discrimination. He did not want discrimination going on. Madison was a key player on the other side who said we should have discrimination. And I believe Jefferson supported him as well. But the idea was, hey, these are these people who bought the original bond. They're the ones who were supporting the country at the very beginning. They're the ones who fought for us, and oftentimes, like many times it was soldiers who had bought this. And the people who then bought the bonds from them were the shady finance guys. These are the people who would become Wall Street financiers. We don't want to support those guys. We want to support the original buyers, the common man. Main Street versus Wall Street is basically what this original debate was about. Some people thought the original buyers had been taken advantage of, that this was desperate times, and if they had just held on to this bond, they could have gotten big payouts, but instead these shady financiers come in and they buy up all these bonds on the cheap. Basically, they're thinking these original buyers were victims, and Hamilton is very against this view. He says, how do we know that that money that they received at the time wasn't worth more to them than if they had held on to it for a while and actually redeemed it? The way to think about this is, yes, if I'm in dire straits right now and I'm struggling, I have this bond that's going to be worth $100 in a year, but I don't have any food. So if I don't sell this thing, I'm not going to be alive to collect that money in a year. But if I sell this thing right now for a cheap price, I can at least have money today to buy food, and I can survive for another year. And it's better. My life is more valuable to me than making sure I could collect that $100, or like maybe collect it, right? I'm probably going to be dead before I reach it. Hamilton's also like, how do we discern between the times where it was just and unjust? Like, how do we make that decision? It's going to be so costly. It's going to be such a huge burden to find every original buyer and then figure out whether they justly or unjustly sold their bonds to somebody else. Another argument he makes is the need to protect property rights. Imagine instead of a bond that you have a super rare comic book, which this is not, but imagine this is super rare. Imagine this thing is like an original Spider-Man first edition, whatever, $15,000. I sell this to somebody because I need some money today, and then I go to the government and say, oh, you know what? I was in dire straits at that time. You know, I really felt forced to sell that. I don't think I got the money I deserved. So can you please get that back? And the government comes in and says, yeah, sure, here you go. Here's your comic book back. We're not going to go compensate that guy who gave you that original money because we feel like he took advantage of you. What's that going to do to people in the market when they have these valuable things? Well, you're gonna always be worried, the buyers at least are always gonna be worried that if they buy something, the government could come and take it away from them. It's gonna destroy freedom of exchange. Hamilton is really worried about this. This is a legal capacity issue. He wants to make sure that we're protecting property rights, that people can exchange freely with confidence. So he's very much against the idea of discrimination. He wants to pay whoever holds onto the bond right now. Hamilton wins on that issue. They decide to go for whoever's currently holding the bond. The next issue on the table is assumption. I go into a lot of detail on this in my video on reacting to Hamilton Cabinet Battle #1. Fantastic video to watch, fantastic rap. It's brilliant, it's beautiful. I go into the details in this rap. Let me just go ahead and give you the overview of this, but if you want more detail, go ahead and check out that video. So Hamilton wants the government to assume state debts, the central government to assume all the different states' debts. Why does he want to do this? Well, there are a few different reasons. One, he wants uniformity of policy. He doesn't want to set some sort of distortionary policy. So imagine you have two states like Massachusetts and Virginia. Massachusetts has a big debt, Virginia has basically no debt. Since Virginia doesn't have any debt, they don't really need to have high taxes, whereas Massachusetts needs to have at least some taxes so that way they can pay off that debt. Well, high taxes in Massachusetts, no taxes in Virginia. What's that going to do to some people? It's going to make them leave Massachusetts and go to Virginia. They're going to say, yeah, I'm not going to stay in this high tax area. I can do the same thing down in Virginia. Well, as more and more people leave, Massachusetts is going to need higher taxes to try and pay this. They don't have as many people. They need higher taxes on the people that stay, which is going to force out more people, and we're going to get people distorted across the country just because they don't want to pay taxes. That's not a system that Hamilton wants to develop. And so if you have a central government that's collecting all the debt, or at least that's paying the debt, then you can avoid these distortionary policies that are going to send people all over the country. Another reason is that he wants the rich, the elite, invested in the success of the country. The people who are going to hold the bonds for this debt are going to be the rich in the country. And the only way they're going to get paid back is if the country continues to succeed. So he's trying to create skin in the game for the elite. Finally, he also wanted a federal monopoly on customs revenue. He didn't want different states able to collect customs. He just wants the central government to collect all customs revenues and go towards this debt. Now, one of the big questions was it fair that different states have different levels of debt and the central government was going to assume all those different levels of debt? For instance, Massachusetts really did have more debt than Virginia. Is it fair that now Massachusetts' debt burden is going to be paid by Virginians? Hamilton believes so because a lot of these debts were incurred fighting the American Revolution. He thinks, hey, everyone's benefiting from these debts, but only one state is paying for it. We should let everybody pay for it so that way that burden is shared equally since everybody's enjoying the benefits of it. Now, there's a little bit of nuance in this assumption discussion. Hamilton did want some debt at the beginning to establish credit by paying it off and also to get people invested in the country, in the future of the country, but he did not want perpetual debt. He said the creation of debt should always be accompanied with a means of extinguishment, which is why in the report on public credit, he also provides a detailed plan on how they're going to collect taxes so they can pay it off in the long run. Hamilton wins on assumption. So he won on discrimination. They paid whoever is holding the bond. He also wins on assumption. The central government assumes all state debts. We have incorporation. I'm not going to talk about incorporation today. That's coming in a future lecture, but he wins on that too. Establishing credit, establishing taxes. This is all investment in fiscal capacity. Now, of course, he also did a little bit of investment in legal capacity, but I want to talk about one of, I think, is a major moment in the creation of legal capacity in the United States. This is the Whiskey Rebellion. To pay off this debt, the government started collecting taxes on whiskey. This was a huge economic shock to farmers. There were a lot of farmers out west, and by out west I mean like western Pennsylvania, West Virginia, those areas. They were farming grains, and these grains were being converted into whiskey, and by taxing whiskey, you were disproportionately taxing farmers in these areas. Now, this led to some growing discontent with the capital. All these farmers were like, why are these people over on the East Coast determining what happens to our economic situation? And they start rebelling. Western Pennsylvania considers seceding and just breaking away from the nation. You have tax collectors coming in trying to grab these taxes, and they're being hoisted and tarred and feathered and just not treated very well. There's all these problems going on with trying to collect this tax. So Washington sees this and he says, We cannot allow this to happen. He mobilizes 13,000 troops to go out and suppress this rebellion. Now, he doesn't have to actually do anything because by the time they get out there, the rebellion stops. They realize, oh my goodness, like if 13,000 troops are coming on us, we are not ready to fight them. And so this is a key moment because there was a law. It's a fiscal law. This is, we're going to collect taxes. And there were people saying, we don't want to live that law. This is Washington at the beginning of this country, right after this Constitution has been established. And he says, there is a law. We are going to enforce that law in our country. This is a key moment for legal capacity. So Whiskey Rebellion with George Washington demonstrates the United States establishing legal capacity. Hamilton's report on public credit is about the government establishing fiscal capacity. So what happens because of these investments in legal and fiscal capacity? Well, the United States gains a reputation for enforcement of rule of law, and they gain a reputation for being really good borrowers. They are willing to pay back their loans. They're willing to always make sure that they're giving you the money that is due you. Because we have the rule of law and because the government can finance maintaining the government and providing things that promise, we have an economy that continues to flourish. Now, a word of warning, many of the institutions that we discussed this semester would be worthless if we didn't have a government willing to enforce them. But at the same time, a government that becomes too powerful, becomes too capable, can easily crush lots of really good things. And so there's this fine balance of you want to make sure the state is capable, but you also want to make sure that it's kept in check. Be ready for the next lecture where we're going to talk about international trade.